Hey everyone, this is Sina with another episode of Into the Bytecode. Today I sat down with Jango and Nnnnicholas from Juicebox. Juicebox is a programmable funding protocol. You might have come across it as the protocol that powered SharkDAO, ConstitutionDAO, AssangeDAO. It's an incredibly ambitious project that's trying to reconceptualize the relationship between shareholders, contributors, how we conceive of a business or an organization from the ground up. And I think one of the most interesting things about the project is how the Juicebox DAO is built on top of the Juicebox protocol. There's a full closed loop and they're dogfooding this protocol in operating their own organization. I also want to give a shout out to Nnnnicholas, who runs an awesome podcast called Web3 Galaxy Brain. He goes deep into smart contracts and how they're architected, and as you'll hear, he's a very thoughtful and articulate person. So I recommend you check him out. Before jumping in, I also want to give a note that nothing we talk about here should be construed as investment advice. Getting into the conversation, the first voice you'll hear will be Nnnnicholas, and Jango coming in soon after that. I hope you enjoy.
I first discovered Juicebox last year in 2021 in July, and fell down the rabbit hole via SharkDAO, which was a project on the protocol. I think really it was the largest project at the time when it came out, and it was a group of people raising ETH to purchase nouns right at the beginning of the nouns project, and they successfully purchased the second noun on mainnet, and a bunch of other nouns after that, and have one of the most iconic nouns, actually, the shark. So I came in through that project. I was interested in nouns, and then I found SharkDAO, and I was curious how SharkDAO managed to raise the funds, and that's how I landed on Juicebox, which is the protocol they used to build their project. And I pretty quickly fell in love. I thought there were a bunch of interesting. I thought it had a great ethic and position. It's a DAO building DAO tooling for other DAOs, as well as other projects that maybe don't consider themselves DAOs, but just have a desire to use decentralized rails for doing whatever their project might be. There's a lot of projects that are trying to build picks and shovels for the gold rush, whereas this really is a part of the shift to doing project organizing via decentralized tooling and via Ethereum. So it was a very appealing project, and there were a bunch of network effects and things that I found interesting about the protocol at first. Among them, I noticed that there were independent contributors to the Juicebox DAO who had decided to, very early on in the history of the protocol, split off into their own projects and collect talent with related skills to turn that into projects that could then be service providers to other projects on the protocol.
And this is like, just to call them out, maybe like ConstitutionDAO and PLDAO, which is building the website, the kind of main front end for the protocol.
Yeah, definitely. Those Canoe does community management. Peel does front end development. WagMe does what I call meme warfare. WagMe are the creators of Banny, the joint smoking banana, who's the mascot of Juicebox. And all these organizations have varying degrees of other relationships with other projects. They could be on the protocol or not, but the interesting thing about being on the protocol is, I guess we can get a little bit into the basic mechanic, which is when a payment is made to a project, the project issues tokens to the person who paid, or parameters can be set to split those up in different ways. But the essential mechanism is money goes into a project, and that project's own tokens are distributed to the address that made the payment. So it's interesting because it sort of naturally leads to an ecosystem of projects and allows for projects to be stakeholders in each other, especially in the ones that they have financial relationships with. I really appreciated that orientation, where we could imagine a genuine alternative to, I think a lot of startups are on this treadmill where, even really inspiring companies like Apple, to me as a child, was a very inspiring story, and it continues to be a great product company. But I think there may be problems with 150,000 person organizations in general. I think that they have certain limitations. They always have to be growing. They have this quarterly performance requirements, et cetera. So, and they always need to be expanding into new areas and growing what it is that they do in order to keep the stock price rising, et cetera. So I'm interested in one angle on what decentralized organizations can change in societies, potentially allowing for much smaller organizations that have a much more specific remit. And so those are some of the things that interested me about Juicebox in the first place. I hung around and was a contributor for about 7 months. I took a few months off. I was interested in doing some NFT projects. And after a few months of tooling around, I realized there just was nowhere else that I wanted to work rather than on Juicebox for Juicebox DAO and on the Juicebox protocol. It's just so compelling to me. So after a few months break, I came back and started poking around and seeing if people would be interested in having me be a contributor. And for context, when I decided to take some time off and step away, everyone was very understanding, and there was no bad blood or any feelings like a betrayal or anything like that. People were very supportive. You know, if you don't want to, if you want to do something else, go do that. You'll be doing the best work you can if you're passionate about it. And I think that's the general ethos at Juicebox DAO. And one of the things that makes the Juicebox ecosystem special is that there is this feeling that everyone is there by choice. No one is forced to be there. No one is coerced to be there at all. Everyone's really choosing to be there, especially Juicebox DAO is the one I know the best. And I think that that ethos spreads to some extent to other projects in this early culture of Juicebox. So when I decided to come back, I said, hey, would people be interested? I just can't stop thinking about Juicebox. So I'd like to come back. And people were very supportive of the idea. There were, you probably saw in the Discord, people were very ecstatic about the idea in via reacts and messages. And so I followed the same process that we've kind of naturally evolved over time. I think part of it comes from Jango and other early contributors to the DAO, but this process of basically we perceive of the DAO, at least I'll speak for myself, I perceive of the DAO as a permeable DAO where we allow anonymous contributors, we encourage contributions from anyone, including people who don't have a resume or a reputation. They're not going to import their Web2 reputation into the Web3 ecosystem. And so in order to prove out who they are and to build trust, we have a kind of process that is just suggested. Anything could happen. You could do something different, but the way people seem to successfully onboard into working for the DAO is exactly what I did when I came back. And that process was making a few little contributions, hanging around, getting back up to speed with what's going on. So doing little helpful things around the Discord, around the DAO, and then making a governance proposal for a one-time trial payout. And Juicebox DAO operates on a 2-week governance and funding cycle. So I made a proposal to do a trial 2 weeks working for the DAO for a smaller, I don't remember what the sum was, but something around $500 to $1,500 is a typical amount. And in that period, I suggested some things that I could do during 2 weeks or 4 weeks. I forget how long exactly I did the trial. And I made the proposal to governance, and it allowed the members of the DAO, the holders of the JBX token, to vote if they were in favor of that. In the end, they were. So I did a trial payout and sort of built further rapport with the current set of people who were building the DAO and the protocol, and sort of narrowed down what it is that I could work on. And then after 2 or 4 weeks, our typical durations, a couple governance cycles, I made another proposal for a recurring payout. And those are 7 cycles long, so about 90, 100 days long, and have to be renewed every 90 or 100 days. And those recurring payouts mean that you get paid every 2 weeks, and typically at a somewhat higher salary than the original trial payout. So it lets you sort of build rapport with the group, see that there's a good fit and something that they really want to do. And it's easier. Of course, someone could just drop in and say, hey, I want to immediately do a recurring payout proposal, but they'll have a harder time winning governance right. votes. So I think one thing that makes Juicebox unique is that while it's not currently on-chain governance like some really on-chain maxi DAOs, I do actually think it has a very healthy governance process where we do anywhere between 8 and 25 proposals per 2 weeks. It happens regularly on a 2-week cycle, and we have a lot of engaged people voting. And it's not like a very rare process to have something succeed in governance. Instead, it's very common that the DAO is giving input on what they feel is worthwhile spending money on.
Totally. It's almost, seeing this proposals channel in the Discord and these proposals get regularly approved. It's almost a narrative violation of a larger group of people being able to make decisions quickly. I definitely want to get into some of the nuances of how you think about decision making and how these sorts of things have evolved. But I think one of the things that has happened in other DAOs that are, fully on chain, every token holder has to vote, and some quorum needs to be reached, is that decisions just don't get made. And especially risky or somehow non-consensus decisions don't get made. But we can get to that. Jango, maybe if you want to jump in, how does the Juicebox protocol itself work? And I think it has, some very wise ideas, like these funding cycles that Nnnnicholas was talking about, this notion of like default expiry, people opting into things, always having an ability to exit. I'm curious, what are the core design goals or pillars of the protocol and how you think about them?
Yeah, so this has evolved over time from the original seed of thought, which was meant to solve another problem me and some friends were trying to build mobile apps in Web 2, and has certainly evolved through those early days of Juicebox that Nnnnicholas was describing into the protocol that it is today, this more kind of evolved version 2 of it. The original seed of thought was, hey, if we're building software as a service, the unit economics doesn't really justify charging per unit. You can just obviously always dish out more copies of your software. And sure, you have to maintain these costs for serving your compute and your databases and paying people to build, but a lot of spend goes into like advertising and growth and stuff like that, where a lot of the projects I was working on in 2015, 2016, we were just bringing users into a Slack channel at the time and really building a community with our users and talking about what we were building and being very open with conversations. And so it was hard to like bridge the product we wanted to build with also the financial aspect and figure out like what to charge. And then meanwhile, everyone around was slapping subscription models on things or telling people to like overcharge because like, you have to like whatever. And I think like I had a seed of thought that was just too compelling to not really follow up on. I have all the inputs to put up a number, like what does it cost to sustain this project? And I could come to that number on a monthly basis, that aggregate all cost for service providers and what we wanted to get paid. And I could put that number out there. Let's say it's like 20K a month. Then the users, you could suggest a monthly price or a price, and then users could pay as much or as little. And if that cost was not met, then we would turn off the service and we would go do something else. Great. If the cost was, if we had abundant fees come in, then everyone's price could be essentially pushed towards zero as we got more people using it. Because, if we get 1,000 more people using the app and ping, then everyone's price gets pushed towards zero because the core cost of running it doesn't scale at the same rate. So then everyone's somewhat incentivized to help be the propagation machine, right? So we're not spending extra on ads, we're just spending extra on people as they pay fees. And so the initial model was great. How can we, and I started trying to build this in Web 2 stacks with banking APIs and cloud functions. And it was actually a lot of fun, but really, really complex. And just like, you can imagine like trying to talk to banking providers of how to manage these like one-off refunds. That really became the product we ended up.
Wow, crazy. So you were trying to build a thing that someone at any time could like kind of like end their subscription, and as like more users came in, the price of everyone else's subscription would adjust at the same time and go down.
Exactly.
Something like that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah. So and trying to express it in like Web 2 world, there would be these refund calls and like these escrow accounts and whatever. It's just super pain in the ass. But like I was very convinced that this was a compelling business model for like indie SaaS projects that didn't want to pursue VC or like follow the bait of like, quote, how does this become $1 billion project, which like I don't give a fuck about.
So it started as this like business model kind of like idea, like a new business model, which like at its core was, we don't want to have a crazy amount of upside. We instead want to build this in a more kind of like alongside our users. And as the number of users increases, we're going to decrease the price for everyone and kind of like pass on the savings to them. And this will have the kind of second order effect of these users becoming all kind of like owners and champions of the product and helping propel its growth, rather than us needing to like have that extra money to spend on advertising. So it's kind of like shifting to a different kind of like location in the design space.
Exactly. And the builders still have leverage. Like if you push everyone's price down from like $1 to like 5 cents, then like, okay, now we want to pay ourselves like 3 times as much. It's like, great, and everyone's price is 15 cents. It's like you still maintain the leverage point, but now you're playing a more positive sum game between the project builders and the community. And then you start to kind of blend those two worlds of like who's actually building the project. And the answer is always like everyone who touches it, everyone who talks about it, and like wherever that is in the world, right? Like all that is really contributing to the sustainability, like the memetics of like a concept. So how do we model that, right? And then at the same time, it was like 2017, so I was living with someone who's working at Coinbase, so I was like accompanying very closely what was happening in crypto, but more from a number go up perspective. And eventually in DeFi summer, I started really being compelled by these contracts that folks are writing. Early days of DeFi, we had yams, we had sushi, we had Wi-Fi, and that was like really, really, really incredible to start studying these contracts and hearing these developers talk about what could be done here. So I started prototyping there, and then really quickly realized this was the way to express the concept. And so basically made the decision to basically scrap a lot of like the years of work that was in development to prototype this out in contract land. So it was really built from a prototyping perspective, it was built to solve that problem. And then I was going to later, once that was set up, then you can go ahead and build whatever other project you want using that as the core business model. And then thinking about how to express it using contracts and all the primitives that were being popularized.
And then what's interesting too is like, as you switch to building this in crypto and in smart contracts, there's like behavioral change in the people who are surrounding this project, right? So it's just like a more, like people are almost more receptive to new ways of coordinating and new business models. So I imagine that was kind of an unlock too in parallel.
Oh man, it was a coming home moment. Like these were my people. Like ethos were similar. It was like very dev oriented. Like devs have the leverage, and it was a lot more about like building something new, questioning like the core, more like macro econ setup that like we were building software against, and that was really exciting. So it was philosophical in nature, and ultimately it is all about the people. So yeah, it was cool making the shift, although it was a pretty like quiet, like I'm not a really loud person, so once I like was convinced that this was the way to do it, I was working with some friends and we just kind of got to work and started chugging along. And there's obviously learning everything along the way. So it starts off as like one simple contract that does one thing. And then I'm always like, adding like what ifs. And over the scope of several months, it evolves to having all these mechanics that that together solve the original problem, but then also open up other doors for what can be expressed using these levers. So ultimately it's like, all right, cool, Ethereum gives us this global state machine, which is incredible. And Juicebox kind of gives you the data model according to which data can be stored and accessed. And then the product at the end of the day, what it's become is really like if this then that for organizational finances. So like under what conditions can funds come into the project and what happens when they do, and under what conditions can fund leave the project or be redistributed to the community or be accessed by the community, and the constraints around those. And the idea of a funding cycle is basically taking this original kind of DeFi like core philosophy of write an unchangeable, unstoppable machine, and then scoping it into timeframes so that a project can evolve over time and set these immutable constraints with some flexibility, so they can evolve in chunks of time or have total flexibility or be totally immutable depending on what they want to do. That's like the core data structure of Juicebox, is encode your organizational rules around funding cycles and then evolve those funding cycles over time, which is the big decision that project owners are responsible for making, is the reconfigurations of these cycles.
Yeah. Man, so cool hearing about the story. One of the suggested, and a lot of this stuff is tunable when someone sets up a new Juicebox project, but one of the core mechanisms is that anyone who basically sends money to a particular Juicebox project or contributes to it can receive some number of that project's governance or membership tokens in return. So there's this kind of like fluid token swap that's happening, and that's been happening in the case of Juicebox DAO itself. And this means that the organization and the cap table of this organization is always open to new capital contributors. You know, as I was kind of becoming more familiar with the mechanics of the protocol, you know, there's parallels to other projects that I really admire, like Nouns, for example, you know, where there's these like new NFTs going on sale every day. But then what's interesting in the case of Juicebox is that there's like additional things you can tune. Like two kind of key differences with the Nouns model is that and you know, all these things are configurable and a continuum at the end of the day. But one is this notion of like reserve tokens, which is that the DAO itself can choose to, anytime new tokens are being minted as a result of capital contribution, it can kind of carve off or mint an additional piece that it gives to contributors. And so in this way, it balances out contributors having a voice in governance and capital, you know, capital providers having a voice in governance. And I'm just curious how you think about this tension between these two different groups. What have you learned about how it's developed in the case of Juicebox? What do you see when you look at other projects like Nouns that are evolving? Because this has been one of the questions in my mind, in that it's also really hard to quantify these things on a similar scale. Like, how do you quantify like what $1 worth of contribution, how many units of like how many units of work that's like equivalent to? Yeah, I'm just curious how you've thought about this and how it's evolved in the case of Juicebox itself.
Yeah, we had no idea going into how these things were going to be really useful when it was deployed. This was all a big like experiment and just great, we can put this protocol out and then we can start building stuff using it. And then as people started using it themselves, we kind of reduced our role to just making the infrastructure sturdy for people. But the initial intuition for how Juicebox DAO was deployed, which is the first project in the protocol, and so the whole protocol and Juicebox DAO was deployed together, was a 20% reserved rate. So initially when you deploy the project, it has 0 funds in the treasury and 0 outstanding tokens. And whenever funds come in, either via direct contributions, just there's a pay button, or via fees being taken from projects who are also distributing on the protocol, you're going to mint 20% of those tokens inwardly to pre-programmed addresses. At the time, it was just me and Perry, who were the 2 people working on the project. And then the rest, so 80% of the tokens, were issued outwardly to new people. So basically, if you think about it as like you have an inward, like self-preserving aspect and like an outward integrative aspect, we were nobody and we had nothing, and we just had like this body of work, right? Then so it's a tricky point of leverage to really like be really self-preserving when self doesn't really mean much then. So we did 20% as our reserved rate, and then people started and then we started to do the work to build projects on it. That's kind of our form of marketing. I'd rather like build stuff than go out and just talk about what we've already built. And so funds started coming in, and then people started contributing, and then we realized at some point we need to figure out how to manage tokens and make this thing feel fair to everyone participating, right? And that's always a perennial tricky problem, and we still haven't gotten this totally right. It's always a work in progress. And I think over time we've tended towards 50%, like as funding seemed adequate to really carry out a lot of these projects we think are like pivotal to like the core infrastructure. And so now we're at this interesting balance of 50% of tokens issued or created into existence will stay within the people working on the protocol. So it's very kind of worker owned in that way. And then 50% is still accessible for new contributors. But then meanwhile, there's people that aren't DAO sponsored have stood up AMM pools to create markets in between that new issuance price and whatever else. So there's also a pretty wide difference between what the protocol is willing to issue tokens at and what people are currently trading tokens at kind of in the open.
And the protocol is like kind of it's kind of a bonding curve, but that's also kind of adjustable by the project owner.
Exactly. There's one parameter called the discount rate, and that's the rate at which the token issuance is going to decrease per funding cycle. So if we're operating bi-weekly funding cycles and every 2 weeks, the total issuance of tokens for each ETH that comes in decreases by a little bit to give everyone slight pressure to contribute sooner rather than later, or pay fees sooner rather than later. And over time, that discount rate is also tended towards zero to stabilize issuance as well. But it's always a discussion. It's always kind of a moving target, and there's always proposals and discussions that sometimes go through. Other times they just kind of raise these more philosophical questions, which I think most people in the community are really eager to dissect and talk about, which makes the fairness bit a little easier since everything is done in the open. There's no sense of privileged decision making, albeit there's just like people working and people who have worked for a while, people who've participated in discussions for a while. So the sense of legitimacy kind of evolves organically, and sometimes the newest members have like the best ideas.
Yeah, would it be useful to do like a quick rundown of the 5 core mechanics?
That would be awesome. Yeah, let's do it.
Maybe you can do the chopped and screwed version and maybe put it at the front or something if it's helpful to give context. But basically,
we can take our own meandering path through it.
Basically, there's 5, in my perspective, 5 key mechanisms in Juicebox Protocol. The first one is this funding cycle we've talked about. So a project is created, it configures its first funding cycle to open fundraising. And the funding cycles have a bunch of different parameters. The first one is the funding target. That's how much you're aiming to make. So in the Jango's original example, the impetus for the whole project, that would be like, I'm working on a project. I want to make some kind of software, or maybe it's not a software, but it's an easy example. I'm working some open source project, let's say, and it's going to be me and a friend, and we each earn around this much in the market. So that's what we want our salaries to be to work on this project. And so our goal is our salaries times for the duration of the funding cycle, which could be typically 2 weeks or a month, or you could make it even open-ended duration. But in Juicebox DAO, we set it at 2 weeks. So you say, all right, this person and me, we each want $5,000 a week, and we're going to do a 2-week cycle. So we need $20,000. That's our funding target. And anything that you raise above your funding target falls into what's called overflow. And overflow is funds that are not accessible during that funding cycle. You'll need to set a new funding cycle and a new funding target, and that funding target can eat into the overflow. So it's sort of like money that's set aside that you have not yet earmarked for anything, and it just sits in this overflow pool. And when a person makes a contribution, as Jango mentioned, either through the pay function or maybe buying an NFT, and it sends its primary sales revenue or secondary royalties to a Juicebox project, all those revenue sources generate tokens. So money comes in and tokens are generated outwardly. So all the tokens for all the projects are, by default at least, uncapped token supply, which is part of the reason that tokens like JBX, the token associated with the Juicebox project, the Juicebox DAO, are difficult to, they aren't as easily made into speculative tokens as projects that do like one-time large airdrops, where they have a fixed total supply and a pie chart of who's getting how many tokens. Instead, with Juicebox projects, you start with 0 tokens issued, and people who make financial contributions one way or another are receiving tokens in exchange.
It's a very interesting balance between pre-committing to an inflation schedule of like when value flows into the DAO, new tokens are minted, and it's going to follow this bonding curve. So it's committing to that without committing to a particular supply and the rate of growth, because like there may just be like 10 massive users who come in a month and mint a ton of tokens. So it's a very, it breaks that like speculative price reliability that you might want to have as a trader, but turns it into more of this like cooperative.
Exactly. And you're getting tokens because you made a financial contribution. So, and the tokens that you're getting, what we call project tokens, because they're unique to each project, they each have their own token. Those tokens are a claim on the overflow. So all of the funds that come into a project in excess of its funding target during a funding cycle can be redeemed by taking the project tokens that you received when you made a contribution and redeeming them in the protocol and getting the proportion of those tokens over the total supply of tokens worth of the overflow. So essentially it means that money that isn't earmarked as part of the funding target in a funding cycle is in this overflow pool, and that pool essentially belongs to the people who hold the tokens, the people who created the treasury in the first place. There's an extra little wrinkle here, which is the reserved rate that Jango alluded to. And the reserved rate lets you say, when someone makes a contribution, the project is going to generate a bunch of tokens. How many of those tokens go to the person who paid the fee? And how many of those tokens go to a reserved list of typically builders or other people who have an interest in the protocol, but are contributing in a way other than financially, such as building the project in question, doing something useful. So typically that's like being a developer, being a community manager. Maybe in some other projects, it could be being like a advisor or a venture capitalist or something. You might want to peel off some of these tokens and direct them at a short list of reserved addresses. So this lets you compensate people who are making financial contributions with a stake in the project, while also pointing a part of that stake at people who are maintaining the protocol without consistently making financial contributions. So more than just financial contributions are rewarded and become stakeholders in the project. So those mechanisms are the funding cycle, the funding target and overflow beyond that funding target, the reserved rate, which points some of the tokens at a short list of people who are being helpful, and the redemption rate, we didn't talk about exactly yet. So redemption rate is if I go to redeem my tokens and get a portion of that overflow, if the redemption rate is 100%, then I get exactly the portion of the overflow that is my number of tokens that I'm redeeming over the total supply of tokens. So I get just a proportional share of the overflow directly into my wallet, and the tokens are destroyed. If I set a redemption rate that's less than 100%, then I get that amount less than the proportional. So let's say I set 50% redemption, 50% redemption rate, then I'll only get 50% of my share of the total token supply worth of the overflow. So it's a way to sort of limit people's interest in essentially refunding their share and to keep some capital in the project so that people, maybe the project has some motivation for doing that. And the final mechanism that I think is one of the core mechanisms is the discount rate. And what the discount rate does is when you program your second funding cycle, if you set a 10% discount rate, then vanilla Juicebox projects issue 1 million project tokens per ETH contributed. So if you set a 10% discount rate in your second funding cycle, then in the second cycle, it'll only generate 900,000 tokens per ETH contributed. So you can sort of curtail how many tokens are being issued over time as the risk for being involved in the project diminishes.
They'll roll over automatically. So you have like the overflow also serves as a runway in a way, since these funding cycles are just kind of looping. The discount rate will tick down automatically just as time goes on. That was well put, Nicholas. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's useful for people to have a perspective, because the point is that all of these tools are given to every person who wants to create a project. And a project could be something like SharkDAO we talked about earlier, or it could be a very small project that only has a few people who are going to be really responsible for the thing, but other people want to be supportive. We've seen charitable projects. We've seen large projects like ConstitutionDAO. So it's not exclusively like DAO tooling trying to capture the DAO tooling market. Instead, I think these are mechanisms Jango came up with through the process of development. And when I discovered them, I think the reaction a lot of people have is like, this is confusing. This doesn't align to what I expect for like speculative ERC20 token
Right.
assets. And couldn't this be simpler? Couldn't you just remove all of these mechanisms and make it more like things I'm familiar with? And I think the challenge for people, which I've gone through myself, is to I believe recognize that these mechanisms are actually interesting enough and essential to creating projects that allow people to become stakeholders in the project itself, that they're worth learning and actually are significant in the same way that a lot of Ethereum concepts were foreign to people before they were familiar with them, but ultimately have proved useful.
I totally agree. I mean, they each seem like kind of fundamental primitives or core building blocks that are needed to build. And it's also interesting seeing the parallels between these mechanisms and what Jango was describing as like the original inspiration of like building a new type of company. You have a unique perspective on this because you're operating Juicebox using this protocol. Like you have the full closed loop. Yeah, have you run into issues with any parts of this? Because I mean, it's a very ambitious undertaking to design a kind of entirely new way to build a business, like whatever we want to call these things, from the ground up, and completely reconceptualize the relationship between the shareholders, the contributors, like the cap table, revenue flowing in, shares being handed out. Like it's a crazy, like ambitious, creative undertaking. And I mean, like one, just as you were describing, like one of the things which I think you have an answer to is like, how does the core team, for instance, like if there is even a notion of a core team, like how do they plan for the future when the shareholders are continuously opting into being a part of this journey and at any time can redeem their piece of the balance? And you have this redemption mechanism, which allows like the DAO to decide that, no, we want like X% of it to stay here to give the team an extended runway. Are there things that you see as potentially needing to evolve to make this really, really like click?
Yeah, totally. It's been a big work in progress from the start, and I think we've been reflecting on it somewhat out loud. I used to write a lot of blog posts, like kind of short thought spurts, and I think that helped stem some good conversations on ways we can tune these variables over time. We've definitely tuned the redemption rate quite a bit, going from low numbers like 60% to really kind of put the redemption price a little lower to incentivize funds staying in the treasury for longer. And then we've had periods of pushing the redemption rate up towards 100% to basically push the redemption price higher. So if you think about like an AMM price sitting between, it's always going to sit between the redemption price, which is the floor. If the AMM price was lower than the redemption, then it's worth redeeming tokens and then market making. And then there's the issuance price, which is kind of the ceiling of the AMM, because you can always get tokens by contributing to the treasury as opposed to buying them on the AMM. So our job is to kind of tune the floor and the ceiling, taking into account the balance in the treasury and the kind of outstanding token holders sentiment, right? And that's been a big thing that we've moved around a bit to make sure that token holders, they have agency over the funds. But also that builders feel confident in the future that we're building. And that's confident both financially as well as like everyone here is just individuals, right? So we all want similar flexibilities and freedoms and to work with other developers that share similar passions. And sometimes, depending on which stage of the journey we're on, that's going to fit better than others. A good example is this past year, or this past, I guess, about a year now, since like maybe 3 months into the protocol, it became clear that we were going to need a version 2 of this protocol to really meet a lot of the initial needs that people were making do with the original protocol, but it'd be convenient to have these other levers to make it more open-ended. And so a lot of the past year was spent developing this V2. And so it was a lot of kind of eng work and architecting and testing and getting that right. And a lot of that time early on this year, as Nicholas was alluding to, it's not really useful to someone like Nicholas, who's trying to leverage tools to tell stories and build auxiliary tooling to bring more use and traffic into the protocol. So the time off there was very warranted because we were just building shit, and you're you're just trying to figure out how to be most helpful. But then once the V2 is out, then great, now there's a lot of stuff to do, right? Now we can actually build. So that's a great unlock for a lot of what we wanted to do. And now we're working on one of our first extensions that we want to do as a DAO and like funded by the DAO to really set some patterns in place that we think can then be replicatable by other folks to really plug in some contractual outcome that happens when payments come into a treasury. And then you can have some contractual custom outcome on redemptions as well.
So is that, Jango, is that one of the major differences between V1 and V2, would you say?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, just the extensibility, and like you can bring your own data source and delegate for like what for both the pay function and the redemption function. The core Juicebox pay function was very stripped down, trying to be as efficient as possible to accept funds and issue out project tokens. So projects can now bring their own risk and their own expenses and their own whatever for that event. And then we kind of make generalized tooling that projects can plug into. But I think the big thing that's still a big work in progress and maybe forever will be, and this goes back to the nouns question. All Juicebox initially is like a pay function. And the best way to express that visually is a text field that you put a number in and you click pay. And that's a pretty boring way to fundraise. It's like the most stripped down thing you could possibly do. Whereas nouns basically, like the auction is basically a fancy pay function, a more engaging pay function.
Right.
And so what you can do is take any fundraising mechanic, NFT wise or whatever happens in the future, and then route it to the pay function because it's all contracts anyways. So then like why would I go to a project and click and send an ETH to it and click pay when I can instead buy a work of art or an article or something that a piece of content this project is promoting for that same 1 ETH. I pay a little bit more of gas maybe to actually manage the extra storage, but it's well worth it. And so that's kind of the world that we're now stepping into now that the fundamental structures are in place. Is how can we now create more generalized, compelling fundraising mechanics that projects can then take and make pointed applications out of.
Yeah, so this V2 functionality, which essentially lets you bring your own additional contract with its own logic that will be executed when anyone makes a payment or when anyone does a redemption, allows you a lot more extensibility, but it doesn't remove any of the functionality of V1. It just gives you the option to add your own stuff. So Jango was referencing there the ongoing NFT rewards project, which will essentially check, is the payment above a certain threshold? If yes, then issue the NFT associated with that threshold, like tiered reward NFTs based on payments. So suddenly you're getting NFTs issued based on calling the very same pay function you were calling before. Simultaneously, I'm working on a little experimental project to see about making an NFT auction, something like the spirit of nouns, where the auction proceeds are pointed into a Juicebox project. And we're exploring if maybe the NFT itself can be, you can redeem the NFT for a portion of that overflow that we talked about earlier, rather than directly dealing with the fungibles. So there's a huge field for experimentation that's possible. On the nouns question, I think a couple of the big differences that I see, and basically I don't think there's really like, I think it's way too early to think about competition. I always think about years ago, I met C-suite people from MasterCard, and I asked them about Square. It was like early on in the days of Square. And they said, no, actually, we don't see Visa or Square or any of these things as our competition. We see cash as our competition. Cash is the big thing we're fighting. And I don't think we're so much earlier than even any of that kind of logic in the space that I'm really interested in the way that Juicebox positions itself as composable on-chain immutable contracts, where even if you have a V1 project, when V2 came out, it's up to you as the project owner to decide if you'd like to upgrade to V2 and transport all of your tokens, et cetera, your community into the V2 protocol. It's not something that the protocol can force on you. So it's a very different logic to Web 2 dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
And however, there are some observations I have about the nouns thing that are interesting. I think one difference, and maybe an even better comparison for the redemption mechanic, is the Moloch rage quit.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of redemption in Juicebox is sort of like a rage quit, but it lets you do it like fractionally of your membership. It's not a
Right.
binary decision. You can redeem a part of your token holdings in a project without exiting completely, whereas
Yeah.
Nouns doesn't have that kind of mechanic built into it.
Yeah.
But you know, I'd be interested to see how they can work together. Actually, are these things where a Nouns auction
Totally.
or treasury with the NFT driven Governor Bravo fork can be intertwined with the Juicebox? I think there's a lot of potential for composable contracts here.
For sure. But the ecosystem can also surprise with how it grows exponentially. Like exponential curves are really hard to grok beforehand. But I definitely feel like we're in this early stage of even uncovering what these primitives are and how they could each be used. And yeah, I mean, one of the interesting ways that the nouns mechanism could compose with the Juicebox mechanism is, yeah, nouns are non-fungible, right? So you have these quantums of like capital and contribution that could be quantified in a particular NFT, but you can't really like interface with people outside of that, other than paying them with the ETH in the treasury. Which also there's an interesting parallel to Juicebox of like conversations I read in the Discord, which is, Jango, you were kind of making this point of not paying people in JBX tokens, but instead paying them out of the treasury and giving them the kind of like option to go and buy JBX on the open market, which I think is also what Nouns tries to do. It just pays people in ETH and says, go and buy Noun with that in an upcoming auction. It's very, very interesting.
I definitely see it reminds me a little bit of this airdrop thing, because I feel another point of comparison or interesting dynamic between DAOs is where their point of origin is and how that informs their culture. I find a lot of the projects who do these large airdrops have really wonderful core teams, but they end up giving this token out, and it sort of becomes like a PvP token for who can extract the most value by selling at the high, rather than creating a community in which the people who hold the token are the people who actually want to engage in governance, rather than just like hodl until the like the prime moment to sell.
Totally.
So I think there's more to be discovered about that, and that's actually one thing that I find really compelling about Juicebox, that the issuance of the token happens over time and can be directed separately from salary compensation. You know, I was listening to your conversation the other day with Nadia Asparuhova. Is that how you pronounce her name?
Yeah.
And talking about salary compensation for open source projects. And I think Juicebox is really, to me, Juicebox DAO is one of the most interesting projects on the protocol, because it's so successful at demonstrating that if you have an open source project with on-chain revenues, you can have a project that both pays salaries to developers, full-time, part-time, occasional contributor, and also creates this option for stakeholding in the project, as it has a longer life than just the duration of the salary that you're earning for the project. So I think there are interesting new models that Ethereum enables, and Juicebox in particular enables, around open source projects, or really any project with an on-chain revenue stream. One of the things that I'm really interested in is like, you know, Jango referenced like me coming back right as the protocol is ready for exploring other things. I want to demonstrate to people over and over again, so the message gets through, that a Juicebox project can have multiple sources of revenue. So you could be dropping multiple NFT collections. You could have a DeFi protocol that takes fees and points them at a Juicebox project, and that really Juicebox, although it's maybe has been popularized as an equivalent to like an ETH Kickstarter or something, actually it's much more like a bank account for running a decentralized organization.
Right. It just has a notion of like debits and receivables, and it's more fundamental than that. It's like the building blocks of an on-chain organization or business.
Exactly. And one aspect of this that I think is under represented in the market's understanding of Juicebox is I think there's these open source projects like Juicebox Protocol development itself that's a good fit, but there's also all of these NFT collections, which are, whether they know it or not, open source projects with on-chain revenue streams. And I think it would be very interesting if those projects said, look, we're going to take 10% of our primary sales or 50% of our secondary royalties, some numbers, I don't know what the right numbers are, but point those at a Juicebox project and give the token holders of our NFT collection governance over what we do with those funds. And some projects have experimented with this, like Cryptodes and Doodles, I know both have DAOs where the NFTs are governance votes in, I believe it's usually a multi-sig treasury that they're using rather than an actual treasury protocol. But what's cool when you start using Juicebox for those things is you give people like transparent information into how you're going to use the funds in advance of using them. So I think it's very interesting to give communities, you know, if you believe that your NFT collection is a kind of community on chain, some kind of metaverse community or whatever, then I think it makes sense to give them some power and to give them some assets to manage together to fund what projects they think moves the community forward.
Yeah, it's something that I find very interesting in this conversation with regards to managing funds and paying contributors. If the funds are themselves backing the governance asset, so in the case of Juicebox DAO, the JBX token is backed by the fund from the treasury, right? You can redeem the JBX and get funds out of the treasury. Then you create this incentive of like, in order to justify spending on anything, the trade-off is the thing that you own will be worth a little bit less in the meantime, right? And so you have this like tug and pull, and then you as a community have to decide your time horizon, right? Like, cool, all right, is it worth spending this much on a recurring basis to do the work to then create a system whose expenses maybe tend towards zero over time so that value can accrue? Or is it worth just sitting and doing nothing, right? So in the case of these NFT collections, it could also be compelling to have those same NFTs backed by the funds in the treasury so that there's like a floor. And then the decisions to spend aren't just like, oh, we have funds, so we must spend them. It's this interesting actual.
Totally, because you can't redeem them.
Right.
This is the equation that any kind of like business owner or operator should have in their mind at all times, right? Of like, is this dollar like invested, allocated, going to have a positive ROI, or is it better to just pay this out in dividends? And I mean, there's some subjectivity in how each person evaluates the future of the project, and also dependence on the time horizon that they have, right? If someone's like looking to exit within 3 months, like they will make certain optimization, like a certain trade-off. But if they're taking like a 20-year time horizon, or like not even like multi-century time horizon, they're trying to like build something that outlasts themselves, they would make a different trade-off. And we can even see this like in the case of Twitter, for example, and this battle they're having with Elon Musk, where I think they moved past this discussion point, but like the management team could have a certain view of the future potential of this business, and then their acquirer is making the opposite case, and what's at stake is like billions of dollars. So very interesting to work through these types of questions with a community. And then, you know, what's additional here is that everyone always has the option to exercise this right, like according to the protocol. Like there's always a right to exit, and there's always a right to enter into the agreement. So I think it will just naturally resolve itself into a different kind of like point in the game theoretic space, or like how things evolve.
Right. It's so interesting. And I think we're very lucky to have a sizable treasury. So like huge shout out to everyone who's contributed to making this experiment possible. And then also an incredible group of developers and thinkers and storytellers. I don't know how this particular group ended up floating into these discords and contributing, but
a rare group of albino unicorns, as I've heard the group refer to itself.
Yeah, exactly. It's pretty special, but and everyone understands and enjoys the complexity of these conversations. So we like to have them often. We like the whole compensation discussion are often my favorites, because you really have to create a sense of confidence, and everyone has to really grok the trade-offs. And if we can enjoy the day-to-days in between these longer term time horizons, I think we'll be pretty well off.
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on compensation and the broader question of open accounting and doing all of this out in the open. And I'm curious about what you find inspiring or compelling or required about like this model, like that this needs to be the case. And then I'm also curious about like what kind of guiding principles or policies have you evolved in going about these sorts of conversations, because they're very difficult ones to have. And this is one of the biggest questions I have about this kind of larger movement. And I am very inspired by it, but I also sometimes think that it kind of hooks into deeper human issues of like comparing oneself versus other people, like notions of fairness. And like, I think people's estimation of the value they're bringing and the value other people are bringing, and these things being, people would rate these sorts of things differently. People don't necessarily have don't approach it from the point of view of, okay, like what is the market rate for these different things? How irreplaceable is this person? Like what are all the intangible values that they're bringing? So there's a lot of nuance and complexity around this. So yeah, just opening up this piece, and I'm really curious about what have you learned about navigating these sorts of things?
I'm a big fan of open accounting. I think it plays itself out well over a longer period of time. If you're willing to be patient and have these discussions. If you're scared or trying to dance around these discussions, I think it's very dangerous. But then I think so is closed accounting in under the same circumstances. It's like the goal essentially is that you want to create an environment that attracts other people who are going to be like assets to the mission statement, right? To like the thing we're trying to do, which isn't Juicebox DAO confined. It's largely Web3, Ethereum in principle. So it's hard to draw boundaries, right? But the payout is a big component of that. It's creating an environment that people feel supported and welcome, and it encourages curious minds to come in, and while also creating a DAO's immune system. So like actually facilitating conversations that actually critique in a compelling way. Sometimes you try to find that line. Sometimes you push over the line, you figure out how to communicate your way around it. It takes some moments of sincerity and then, colored by many moments of levity. But yeah, you have to really create that DAO immune system that knows like, all right, how are you going to take in some random new idea or some random new influence and make something productive of it, or just kind of try to repel it from the system altogether. I think all these behaviors are fairly healthy, and there's a lot of kind of organic precedent that we can look at. I also think I guess on the line of the organic precedent, the like DAO mitosis concept is also compelling, where if an organization is growing big enough to the point where maybe it's managing payouts and the DAO is making decisions for several unrelated, like smaller decisions in several unrelated departments, if you will, like evaluating front-end contributors, evaluating folks working on legal frameworks, et cetera. It's oftentimes better to skinny up kind of the foundation treasury and then grant funds to auxiliary treasuries for self-management. So it's leaner, and then folks can have a better conversation about how their time spent relates to the group's cumulative resources. I think those are like, so creating little pockets of autonomy and of experimentation, as well as just really structuring conversation and channels, and not necessarily structuring in like a rigid way. I think Zug and the community managers at Discord have done a great job of just setting up a Discord in a way that that conversations can evolve fairly organically. And also shouts to engineers at Discord too. I think the tools are pretty useful. Yeah, but it's
Mm.
all about the people, right? It's always all about the people, and the people are going to bring their flavor, their taste, and just have to be aware
Totally.
that, like, hey, we're building internet shit, and there's going to be, and we're all a bunch of weirdos, we're all a bunch of passionate
Yeah.
weirdos, and like that's going to express itself in all kinds of ways, and you better love it, or else like the space isn't
Right.
for you, right?
Totally. So on the point of the creating smaller pockets, so the like the analog to that in a traditional company might be, there's like a product team that's working, on a specific product, instead of the management team, deciding on that team's compensation and like, trying to somehow keep it in line or balance it with other product teams. You just kind of give a grant to that team with an estimate of just like how valuable that work in that direction is, and
Mhm.
then give them autonomy to distribute that however they want, hire the team, grow the team, shrink the team, like whatever they want to do, as long as they deliver on the outcomes.
Yeah, you can pursue other partners and business models. Now you have competition. So like, okay, cool. If you have better opportunities, then now we can find individual leverage across different things. We don't have to hold each other to like unreasonable constraints, or rather like non-productive constraints that seem like artificially grounded. I think like just reducing, always trying to reduce ourselves to individuals and people, as opposed to these rigidly bounded teams, is useful. Like it's nice to have treasuries that you can manage payouts from, but those don't necessarily have to also correspond to like the thing that you pledge allegiance to, right? I think there's always going to be floating around. There's always going to be cross-pollination and contribution across all these projects. So being mindful of that is also important. But I'm a big fan of just trying to play out multiple experiments, or at least have a situation that welcomes multiple experiments. So it's tough to like really sponsor or get behind like the official something. Like you want to just kind of
Totally.
allow space for things to happen, and try to support those both socially and intellectually, like being part of the conversation. I think it's like the most valuable thing. And also financially, so folks can spend time on it in earnest.
Yeah. This also rhymes with this concept of subtraction that we kind of evolved at the Ethereum Foundation. And it's really about pushing out scope, responsibility, and to like players in the ecosystem, rather than trying to do them inside of the foundation.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, it's one of the core kind of mental models that I think is incredibly helpful when thinking about these organisms in crypto.
I really definitely agree with smaller organizations. I think I remember sitting in the airport in Paris and experiencing difficulty with a flight and wondering if DAOs could have anything to say to airlines. And I think the obviously it's like a bit of an absurd question in a way, but I think the way that organizations like DAOs, or the decentralized organizations, if they would have anything to say to something like an airline like Air France, it would be much smaller airlines that are maybe regional providers or something, rather than trying to use this model to directly recreate what exists in Web 2, which actually the nature of this kind of endless cancerous growth of organizations, I think could be seen as, I mean, I'm judging it a little bit with those descriptors, but
Well,
it's
in
sort
the
of,
case of airlines, it definitely seems like a good description.
yeah.
I've had
And
my fair share of painful interactions recently.
oh my gosh, it's brutal, and it's because there's such a disconnect between the people who are making the decisions, the people who, if there is even anyone, if it's not just the organization as its own organism that has no particular leader in a way,
Yeah,
that's causing the people who are actually executing the work in the airport to have bizarre, disconnected, distant, cold relationships with the customer, et cetera. There's just so many layers of bureaucracy and abstraction that are not helping to achieve the goal. In fact, they've made the goal something different from providing a quality service. And I think the other thing is that sometimes we encounter people who say things like, some people are very obsessed with this idea of like replacing Discord, with a Web3 alternative. And sure, I'm down. If you find me something that works great, then we'll do it. But there's no need for new technological interventions to directly replace existing products, existing workflows. They are complementary. You know, we didn't destroy books when Kindles came out or when iPhones came out. We still have books. And we still have lots of older technologies that are still very good at what they are good at. And new technologies allow us to explore experiments with different paradigms and different affordances. So I don't expect DAOs to replace all companies. And I think if you're trying to do that, it is skeuomorphic. What I really like the way Jango often frames what we're doing, which is as an experiment. It's not, we're not going to pull our hair out to make it work for a situation that it doesn't apply properly. So I think we're just exploring what does make sense. And for instance, you know, there are some things where we still rely on API providers who are traditional companies. If there are options where we can remove those from the process, then we'll do so. But we're not going to spite the product and the users or you know, developers, whoever's interacting with the protocol, just to stand on a principle where the solution that we can come up with, if we're too strict about it, is really just an inferior result. So we have goals and ideals, but we're also flexible in using what makes sense where it makes sense. And part of having smaller teams that are more agile means that you can have multiple, say, Juicebox projects being service providers that are building front ends or doing community management, and maybe they have different approaches, and maybe one of them has private compensation. Maybe they just take it into the project and then you know, off ramp the funds and distribute them in some other way, versus a project that does it openly, and we get to find out which one the Juicebox DAO community, for instance, thinks is more effective. So it's rather less didactic and top down, and more, let's just see what happens and give everyone the option. You know, I think one thing I really think about Juicebox is that it's sort of like the tool set. We talked about those 5 mechanisms. I think it's really the tools that people need in order to create these kinds of organizations, as if they were delivered from the future in which people already have what they actually need, rather than skeuomorphic tools that are designed.
Working our way from the present to there.
Yeah, exactly. They feel delivered from a future to me.
That's a beautiful
and a future
idea.
that we might not actually get to if we only insist on paying too much attention to what existing institutions expect of us.
Yeah, you almost have to take this inspired leap into the future and see if it works, if it all like shakes out.
Yeah, and the fact that it's all open source, well-known, documented code it's meant, like, we're meant to all eventually, like, given eventual scarcity, we'll be competing on grounds of how we organize ourselves, as opposed to like the actual functionality, because you can just take and copy it, and theoretically the more efficient operating schema should be cheaper, right? Or at least, like, I don't think anyone's expecting to pay zero. I think this whole world is very much acknowledging that things cost money, and good things come when we pay good people to spend their time on interesting problems. But I think that there's also this, like, from my point of view, I can speak individually, like, I'm excited to finish up working on infrastructure for the Juicebox protocol and really setting a safe, risk-averse foundation for us to build on. And then I'm excited to spend time helping other projects that are building applications and other stuff using the protocol actually come to fruition, and then spin off projects of my own. So I'm excited to pull my personal payout from Juicebox DAO towards zero over time. It's great to keep it where it is currently, because it sets that tone that, like, hey, I'm clearly out here spending a lot of attention on this, and so I encourage other people to come in, and if you're going to do something similar, please make sure you're taken care of. But over time, as attention goes into other things, I think it's also healthy to tend towards zero.
Make room for new contributors.
Make room for new contributors, or just encourage the foundation, like the protocol as like a founding open source, always running thing, just to be somewhat finished from like a core perspective. Obviously it creates a lot of avenues for people to bring extensions, so further layers of opportunities and risk that sit on top of the protocol that could be funded by Juicebox DAO, but maybe in a more experimental way, and not just paying people recurringly to solve open-ended problems. But in the early days, like today, it's really nice just to have consistency. So individuals we're not always just funding grants for projects. We're just paying people to be around and to care about the day-to-day and to care about each other and to care about kind of the open-ended projects and create scope and solve problems, but tend towards a world where, hey, maybe we can acknowledge the fact that users are paying, like, risk ultimately is held by people transacting on this thing, and the cost is also borne by them via like the gas fees. And so a lot of the opportunity is going to just keep evolving onto subsequent layers, and then I think value capture will also go there, and then hopefully the Juicebox protocol and JuiceboxDAO and JBX can just kind of be more so managing a more like insurance pool and maybe occasional grants. And certainly storytelling work, as long as that's needed at a first party layer. But I think there's a lot of opportunities to create further layers of opportunity on top of the main Juicebox.
Totally.
And if anyone feels that it's really necessary that there be a Juicebox V6 that changes things up, then they can go do that. It's open source code. They can do that. And if they can convince JuiceboxDAO that that's worth doing, then maybe they can receive some funds or in some way become the primary development contributors at a forever existing JuiceboxDAO. And if they can't, maybe they can deploy their own code and take their own fees and build their own institution. It's very open. And I think Juicebox and the tone Jango and Perry and other early contributors have set is one where you asked earlier about are there core contributors, and I think that's something we really eschew. It's like anybody can come in at any point, and it really is a culture that we've cultivated, I think, successfully. I'm really pleased with it, at least so far, where the best ideas are the ones that win, and we really give a lot of credit to people for being good community members in terms of pushing this kind of collective idea forward and bringing what's the best part of them to the table, not just, oh, you're a front end developer, so you got to be really good at React, and we don't want to hear about your, your rock band. No, we want to hear about that because maybe there's some unforeseen connection that allows the protocol to develop in this like genuinely grassroots cultural way into unexpected places. And I think that's something you can really only achieve with open source projects that are really hardcore open source and enabled by this like global state machine that allows us to collect on-chain revenues for all these different projects, regardless of borders, et cetera.
Yeah, huge shout out to everyone who's built infrastructure and culture.
I want to ask about EF. So does EF see itself as something that will eventually sort of dissolve? I assume Ethereum ultimately ends up being like a piece of solid infrastructure that doesn't see updates at some point. Is that the general philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be careful about speaking on behalf of the EF because I don't work there anymore. And, these are kind of deep philosophical questions. But the way I at least understand the EF's mission is to, I've talked about this on a previous episode of the podcast too. I think it was maybe the one with Josh Stark at the Ethereum Foundation, who kind of like talked about some of his perspectives on this stuff. But like the way I interpret it is that you can kind of imagine Ethereum's, history and lifetime as, in the beginning when the Ethereum network was built, the protocol was built. The effort to do that was quite centralized, right? It's like almost like I'm just thinking of this for the first time, but it's almost like the Big Bang, where like it's this like dense core at the beginning, and then it starts expanding and opening up. But in the very beginning, you can see the first programming language, Solidity, being developed by the EF, the first client, Geth, being developed by the EF, the first conference, DevCon, being developed by the EF. And it's kind of like doing all of the work required to get this thing off the ground. And then, from then to present, there's been this gradual decentralization of the EF very intentionally, and this is what the subtraction philosophy is referring to, is that unlike a traditional organization that's looking to continuously grow, right? It's trying to grow its revenue, grow its headcounts, like do all of this stuff. The EF is actually trying to shrink over time, if that is like correspondent with the ecosystem becoming more robust and flourishing. So through its lifetime, it's basically tried to use its resources, like both its financial resources, its, whatever credibility it has, to help push responsibility and work out to the ecosystem. And this mirrors some of what you're describing with Juicebox, right? So, then, and there's moments, and so, the kind of intuitive response when someone in the ecosystem is like, hey, I'm building I'm going to run a new hackathon series or a new events, thing. The intuitive response is like yes, that's amazing. Like, we want to encourage you to do that, rather than, what a traditional company might think, which is like, oh shit, this is going to compete with what we're doing, right? So then, when say ETH Global comes around, the EF is like, yes, this is amazing. People who are aligned with this ethos, with the future of this ecosystem, we're going to do what we can to help them, give them grant funding, and then help them become self-sustaining over time. And so, that's just happened on multiple dimensions. It happened with funding public goods, with, for instance, Gitcoin grants. It's happened with, a bunch of like the infrastructure with consensus. It's happened with the core Ethereum clients, with now many teams building execution and consensus clients that are soon going to be merged. And now at this point, the EF is playing a much, much smaller role in the ecosystem, but it's still, kind of like stewarding some of the core, both like practical functional things that need to happen, and also some of the values. And the core functional stuff is, for instance, work on the merge to this point, but also, work on like sharding and data availability and these sorts of things. And you can imagine some point in the future where the Ethereum becomes something analogous to the internet, where it just doesn't make sense to even conceive of there being like an org that is required for its like sustaining, flourishing. And I think that's an open question, at least like as far as I know, of like, at that point in time, what is the EF? And that there is probably still sorts of things that are that an organization that's a nonprofit that's fundamentally aligned with this ecosystem can do. Like, it can think much longer term. It can think, across organizational boundaries. It can really like kind of help inspire these leaps. So there may be things for the EF to do even at that point, but the real like through line is to get to this point, and like it's been happening, that that the ecosystem is completely not relying on this organization.
Massive congratulations on that. Yeah, huge body of work.
Yeah, it's super inspiring. I mean, it takes really special people to do this kind of stuff. And so much respect for the people at the EF. And I honestly see mirrors of that in Juicebox and how you guys are approaching things, which is some of what I find really inspiring.
Thank you. That's a great compliment. What Ethereum Foundation is doing is amazing. I'm interested in how, I don't know if it's been a problem so far, but I'm interested in how, with Juicebox, like for instance, I think Jango has kind of led the charge with this idea that Juicebox Protocol doesn't have a voice. It amplifies, the Juicebox DAO can have something of a voice, and its role should be primarily to amplify its contributors rather than to have a centralized style branded voice. And I wonder over time, as contributors do lots of different things and people have different opinions and make different kinds of projects, how if Ethereum Foundation, for instance, has ever dealt with like, what is the EF's position on this, rather than like, because I feel sort of in the social media brand environment, there's an expectation that brands have political opinions. And obviously EF has some opinions about infrastructure, but even then it feels like it gives a lot of autonomy to contributors. So I wonder how we can maintain that logic where it's the contributors who have opinions, and whatever kind of consensus can be achieved among them is something like foundation or organization opinion. But at the end of the day, it really is, everything should really be attributed to independent actors within the organization. I wonder if that's like viable in Twitter, Instagram kind of world.
I mean,
you know?
it's a question I know that folks at the EF have like really like grappled with, and it's a nuanced one. And like one kind of example of it that I think a lot of people aren't aware of this, but it like shows the level of like painstaking, like thought that they're going to is so yeah, the EF doesn't represent Ethereum, and they're like totally distinct things. And I think they, people there go out of their way to always kind of say that, our we don't, any sort of influence is like soft, it's soft influence, and it comes from the credibility that has been developed over time through being a good steward for this ecosystem. But beyond that, there's really no hard control. And one kind of like interesting around like the branding and stuff is, so there's ethereum.org and there's ethereum.foundation. There's actually two different websites, and ethereum.foundation is the EF's website, and ethereum.org is meant as a, ecosystem website. And so the entire process of like ethereum.org being developed as a website, like I know has been an ongoing thing, and the entire thing's like open source on GitHub with PRs and like people contributing. And there's even, some decisions around, okay, a new developer lands on ethereum.org and wants to build, a new smart contract application. Wouldn't it be amazing to just have a tutorial right there that tells them use XYZ tools in your stack and you're done? And instead, ethereum.org has chosen to not do that because it would have to like give preference to certain, developer tools, certain like RPC endpoints, and instead it has like multiple tutorials that it just kind of like puts you towards, and those tutorials are written by people in the ecosystem. So there's no official like this is the Ethereum like tooling stack that you should use. So it's this question of like the branding, the voice, and really like embracing diversity, like allowing multiple independent actors to pursue the good of the ecosystem and have those people occasionally cooperate, occasionally compete, and basing your actions on what is best for like the overall ecosystem is a very interesting problem. And yeah, one thing I know they really think about.
Yeah, Ethereum.org is a wonderful website and really inspiring, especially for some work. I'm working with other contributors at Juicebox DAO to build educational resources, exactly what you're talking about. I mean, everybody's seen the wallet page, which is so unopinionated just sort of tries to lay out the facts, which even that is contentious enough, I can imagine. What
Totally.
are the facts?
Imagine
of
building a page for like layer twos. Like, what do you put on there?
Gosh, but it is to me, it's like, and it's interesting. I pulled up the page now, and it says that it's inspired by the Mozilla Developer Network, which is another really inspiring group of online or open source devs and community. I think it's a big question for us. Like, do we want to build educational resources that are directly financed by Juicebox DAO, or to pay contributors to build them directly, and they're sort of the responsibility of Juicebox DAO, or should we instead have Juicebox DAO fund like multiple parallel grants to orgs, to individuals or projects that they build that are going to create parallel educational resources with different orientation? I mean, one thing that comes to mind thinking about Ethereum.org and tutorials is like, not even, it would be wrong for the foundation or whatever the Ethereum.org group is to push people in the direction of a particular programming language even.
Right,
so
exactly.
But you still want to be helpful. You don't want to be completely neutral on every subject. So it's a fine line, but I find that particular effort really inspiring. I think it's one of the best websites on the internet, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of education and providing clear information about a complicated topic without bias, or with a bias that tries to let people make their own decisions.
Totally. And yeah, it has been a very complicated project. I've only followed from a distance, but massive shout out to Sam Richards, who's been, driving that. And I don't know the team as well these days, but I know multiple other people are involved. They've Yeah, just super thoughtful about how they've evolved it. Last question, thinking about the culture and the people inside of Juicebox DAO and how interwoven that is with the decisions that the DAO makes and how, just things evolve. I'm curious, like, what have there been particular crucible moments when you look in the past? There's been a precedent that's set, or like important kind of guiding principles or philosophies that have emerged out of them. Like, how do you look back on the cultural history of Juicebox and how it's evolved to date?
I mean, it is an ongoing experiment. I've been, one thing I noticed, we have town halls every Tuesday at 6 p.m. US Eastern time, at least. And we have consistently now, yesterday there were, or 2 days ago, there were 37 people in the town hall. And
Wow.
I think after an hour and a half or so, there were still 35 people in the room. And we try to make an effort to keep things, running a good meeting. But I also like to, at the end of the meeting, make time for anyone who's new or who didn't get a chance to speak to just say whatever they have to say hello or intro their project or just ask a question or whatever it might be. And I think I'm always saying that like 30 really dedicated people, or even just 2 really dedicated people, but at this point in our history, 30-ish people who are really dedicated to the project is more valuable than 100,000 fake followers on Twitter or whatever.
Totally.
So I've been really inspired by, I think Juicebox is also kind of a microcosm of this larger phenomenon I discovered when I first started playing around in the Ethereum ecosystem, which is I noticed like, oh wow, I'm Canadian, and I noticed, oh wow, there's a lot of Canadian Ethereum devs. Nice. So I'm like, wow, there's a lot of Canadians around, and the way I read that, and over time I discovered, in fact, there's a lot of devs from India, a lot of devs from Australia, a lot of devs from China, from all over really, from France, from all kinds of places. And I think what it showed to me was that a blockchain with a dedication to open source compared to something like Silicon Valley logic, in the Silicon Valley logic, you have to move from wherever you live to Silicon Valley to get the best jobs. Or you can work at a local outpost, but those probably aren't the top decision-making positions, unless it's like a local strength in something like AI that gives you an office that really is leading the charge on a particular initiative. In general, there's this kind of gravity pull of you have to go to America, you have to go to California, you have to go to the Bay Area. And that's all right. The Bay Area is cool, but blockchains really unlock all this global talent. And the way I read it was, Canada's got a great education system, healthcare, let you take some risks, do some, switch job paths, leave Web 2, try something different, experiment in the evenings. I really admire that about Ethereum and about blockchains in general. And I think Juicebox has that also. So I love that we have such a ragtag crew of global contributors who maybe, we're not like the CTO of whatever, but instead had a lot of talent and have found an outlet for that talent in our community. And it's a very permeable organization, like I was saying. So people can come in, and if they have good ideas and are contributing in an interesting way, they're going to get compensated for it. And we're not gonna say, well, you live in a place where rent is cheaper, so we're going to pay you less. We're not going to do all these kind of sort of punishing gestures that a lot of traditional organizations do. So that's part of what I admire about the culture.
Yeah, the name your own, like numbers, name like basically people are responsible for coming in and saying what they want, what they need. No one's going to give you a templated anything, even though sometimes that's been called. I mean, we give you framing. I think that's evolved over time as suggestions, but yeah, like everyone has to somewhat develop their own sense of leverage, whatever that means, which is exciting. It can be burdensome at times, but over a longer period of time, I think it plays itself out decently. At least reflecting on it now, it seems decent. I think one of the coolest things looking back, though, is recognizing in the year and some change history of the protocol being public and accessible, is we've seen a lot of momentary hype usage of the protocol, ConstitutionDAO, Shark, Assange, and those were really great to get people interested in at least interacting with the protocol. and then trickling, like those who are curious, trickling back into Juicebox DAO to ask more fundamental questions and get involved. But over the scope of this past year, I think a lot of the people in the Discord and a lot of the people in these town halls aren't contributing to the core protocol. They're building projects. They're building like affordable housing projects in Houston, or a food and wine startup in the Bay, or all kinds of things all over the world. And then there's a lot of cross-pollination of ideas where these project creators can now share insights over how they're configuring their treasuries and other more like IRL operational techniques that they're using. And then people contributing to the base protocol then learn from that. And we all kind of are just a bunch of builders working on all kinds of things. And that's the coolest thing, because I feel like a large part of my day-to-day is just to listen to people's big ideas and ask questions that hopefully like lead to some sense of strategy, and then kind of find patterns among all these projects and try to connect dots or be as helpful as I can while also just leaving space for things just to happen over time. And the consequences right now, we've just seen a lot of really more complex, longer term projects start to emerge, and they've been in development, like in the Discord for the past year, just scheming of how we might orchestrate this like StudioDAO that can fund indie films in perpetuity, right? And stuff like that.
Wow.
And those are not startup weekend, bootstrap a treasury, like LFG. Those are like complicated, like legal structures with like orchestrated like sequences of treasuries that empower indie creators as well as community members. And there's like content bits of that. And so we're about to see a bunch of these more like longer term, longer oriented experiments start to come out of the woodworks and try to make a case for themselves and leverage these tools in really creative ways. And I'm very, very excited about that.
What is the shape of StudioDAO, for instance, or another one of these kind of more long-term oriented projects that you think is interesting? Just to provide a brief sketch so I can see what sorts of things people are doing.
Yeah, totally. StudioDAO, there's a really great podcast on this done by Matthew and Briley that I highly recommend, and a series of articles. So, and StudioDAO is now on Rinkeby. How it's organized is there's a main Juicebox project for StudioDAO, and then there's each indie film being funded is its own Juicebox project. The tokens and payout distributions are organized in a way that links the projects together. So StudioDAO takes a fee from the funds raised by the project. The project, in contributing to an indie film and helping to fund it, you mint an NFT across 3 different tiers. So you have an option of what level of patron you want to be for the film. And then that gives you access to be a member of StudioDAO, which then helps to decide which films it's going to put its weight behind. So all the funds accumulated in StudioDAO then get pointed by the community to fund indie films along the way. And so their goal is to really create like a 1 million-person green light committee that can just, over time, funds will trickle in from these fundraisers, and then they can essentially be recycled to fund further films. And it's just being led by some really incredible, thoughtful people who are very entrenched in the media industry and have been pushing the horizon on this stuff since like early days of the internet and of media. So
yeah, definitely check out the Juicecast episode with StudioDAO. I think it's a mechanism I'm still learning about how they're orchestrating the thing. They're using an incorporated non-profit association, I believe it is. Which is sort of one of the hot structures for legal structures for DAOs right now. And I think it's going to be a really interesting experiment and possibly really successful project. So the Juicecast episode with Kenny is a great way to understand how they're structuring it.
Yeah, super interesting. And on this last question, I promise, on the point of legal kind of like regulatory design, like what are models or sketches of different models that you think are interesting or could work with these more kind of like permissionless DAOs?
I think it's a really cool concept to treat profit as a recyclable kind of pocket of resources to further the mission of the DAO.
Mhm.
So the contributions made to projects can perhaps yield you NFTs or participation in decision making, and probably other stuff that we haven't even come up with yet and we don't have words for yet. But from a sense of like rev gen, like treating the DAO's funds as a means for reinvestment, I think is pretty exciting. But I also think it's really cool to really try to figure out how we might shape securities on these platforms and really structure them soundly so that people can create experiments that are highly potent from a number go up perspective too, because we know like the power of these things. And I think what we're trying to do at Juicebox from an info perspective is really give creators and indie artists the toolbox to make sure that they're well funded and supported in their creative endeavors. So however we can give people confidence in doing so, I think it's worth our while.
Yeah, we've seen charitable organizations like 501c3s use Juicebox. ConstitutionDAO, if they had succeeded, had an arrangement with endowment to use endowments access to charitable status to custody the Constitution and to integrate it into a legal model that is well known and understood in the US. We also see these experiments with UNAs, and there's some contributors who are working on sort of laying out frameworks that are available and that people can do further research into. But I think the truth is that it's still very early days for figuring out what all the right structures and options are.
Totally.
And we're not alone in that. Everybody's thinking about this too.
There's some cool tools coming up though. A few contributors have been working a lot on these legal documents that are plug and play with Juicebox configurations. So like actually in the legal agreement that is either signed off on by someone who's an official member, or in Unna's case, someone who agrees to adhering to it as they join the organization. Those docs will soon hopefully be able to be templatized and then spin up, where you can just plug in, all right, what's the reserved rate? What's the redemption rate? What's the discount rate? And all that stuff can kind of inform the legal standing of the organization. And then we can obviously templatize some of these JB parameters to kind of give people a cleaner onboarding experience without having to sift through all of these choices if they're trying to make a very simple thing happen, but give people the full suite if they want something more experimental.
Totally. Like something like Clerky or like Stripe Atlas for Juicebox projects. And it totally, like the kind of modular plugin design and the fact that each project is kind of a new instantiation of a Juicebox project with its own parameters also means that people can continue experimenting with different models and kind of do their own research around what it should look like as a fit for what they're building.
Yeah, and because each project is its own entity and the Juicebox DAO has no access to the funds inside of other projects, they really are all independent. And although they share a protocol, they can operate entirely separately from one another. And we can't, nobody from the DAO can stick their fingers into their treasuries. So it's pretty cool because it really is making more accessible some more advanced tooling than just like a ERC20 deployer, for instance. It really gives you this transparent treasury for a decentralized organization. So I'm excited to see how this legal stuff comes into the picture more over time.
Amazing. Well, we've been talking for some time. I think we can bring it to a close. Thank you both for taking the time. I'm super, super inspired by what you're building. Yeah, gonna be following the journey in the Discord.
Thanks so much. This was great.
Hey, I'm gonna make a small ask here. If you've been listening to these conversations and want to support what we're doing here, I would really, really appreciate if you could leave a rating and a review for the podcast wherever you're listening to it. This might seem like a small thing, but it will really help other people also discover the show. Thank you. I'm grateful to be able to do this and look forward to being here together again soon.